Hello there, folks. So, as most of you know by now, the idea of this channel is that I will be developing and showcasing my own custom card game. But since half the idea of it is just kind of admiring card design and the whole idea of card development, I thought I'd take the time to go into Eternal's most recent card set. Just because I think this is a really interesting one, a really crucial one, as the meta becomes potentially somewhat stale, and I think they've really risen to the occasion. This is a great example of taking player feedback, of evolution in the art department, of adding flavor to a game, of crafting a game's identity. Generally speaking, as much as I was dubious early on here, we're seeing some really cool things taking shape here. And so without further ado, I thought I'd get right into roughly the 40 or so cards we have so far and go over essentially their constructive viability. Some of these may be key drafting cards, may see some play there, but generally speaking, I want to talk about these from just a design perspective and also want to talk about how they'll fare in constructed. So without further ado, let's look at Family Charter. So Family Charter is one of those interesting cards in that it's neutral. So the idea often behind neutral cards in card games is that you're making a card that is either versatile or open-ended enough where it fits in any strategy and therefore it makes sense to make it neutral, or you're making something neutral so colors can have access to something they normally don't. So a great example here is card draw. A lot of colors struggle with card draw. Card draw is something that has been lacking from the game for a while, and something actually that this set addresses. And so this is an example of getting card draw into the game. However, the problem here is simply the fact that because it's non-color, because it's generic, the cost of the card draw is so steep. And the issue here is, how much is a card draw worth? You have to ask yourself. Essentially, you're adding a 3-cost tax to every card that this draws you, and as a result, if you just run the math, essentially, it's not really worth the cards it's getting you at the rate it's getting them to your hand. So I think this is not a particularly complicated card. It's good to have the option just in case. But when you think about what cards can do for you, a good example is Chthon, right? Let's say my opponent has a Chthon, which costs 2, which is one more than this card, which is immediately a 2/3 blocker with endurance. And then, later in the game, they can pay 6, the same cost to activate Family Charter, and then, rather than get 2 draws, Chthon gets flying, and then they get a 4/4 owl of flying. And you could actually make the argument that the 4/4 owl of flying is worth more than drawing 2 cards. So already the owl is worth 1 card, so in a sense that's like drawing a card, but also you're not just drawing the card, you're immediately playing it for free, essentially, if you want to think of it that way. You basically draw an owl, and you play it for free. So you're also not incurring a tempo loss. Whereas when you play Family Charter, you essentially have to take a whole turn off to restock your hand. And there's anything happening on the board, if you're in any situation that's not a board stall, you could take a fair bit of damage in the interim. So long story short, not a particularly good card, I'd say, especially in constructed. As much as card draw is always good, at a certain point you get diminishing returns once it costs too much. Speaking of costing too much, or rather cost in extremes, now we have Helpful Doorbot. So Helpful Doorbot is a weird one. On the one hand, it's sort of a trap, I would say. It's deceptively good in that it's free. And free is always enticing, right? This idea of free. The issue here, though, is what does the free do for you? So long story short, it's tempo. It lets you play it out aggressively. So for instance, you could play potentially 2 creatures turn 1. You could play this alongside, say, an Oni Ronin, which is theoretically pretty good. The issue, though, here is that first, in a tempo-oriented aggressive deck, it actually doesn't do much for you because of its stat line. It's a 0/3, it doesn't have any attack, and therefore, it's hard to really get in with it. Now, you can boost it, potentially. A good example is Bandit Queen. But let's say you play a Bandit Queen, this gets the boost of 2 power, and you attack with it and deal 2 damage. You may feel like you got away with something, but you didn't, really. You managed to get 2 damage off of it, so you'd have to boost your team multiple times throughout the game to get real substantial value off of this, and all the while spending your mana completely efficiently every turn, right? Because otherwise, why not have it cost 1 and have slightly better stats? So long story short, it's just not a good card for that reason, that it's meant for more of an aggressive deck, but doesn't have an aggressive stat line. Similarly, we're starting to see some slower fire decks may manifest, And the problem with this is that as much as it looks like an enticing blocker, because it has no power, it doesn't disincentivize attackers. So, for instance, if my opponent has two 1/1s, they'll still attack, whereas if this had one power, they may not, at risk of losing one of their 1/1s. Similarly, let's say my opponent has an Oni Ronin, they can still attack with it. They may not deal damage, however, they are getting the battle cry trigger, so they're still getting value. Meanwhile, I have a card that is completely useless in any slower match. In a control mirror match, maybe if I'm up against mid-range. And it's also not free. That's the important thing to remember. All cards have two costs. They have their power cost, but then they also have their card advantage cost. Remember, card advantage is one of the most precious resources in the game, maybe even more so than power. And think about what else costs you a card, right? Sandstorm Titan costs you a card. Chthon, his Owl Companion, costs you a card. Meanwhile, this is a 0/3 that costs you the same amount in terms of card advantage as a 5/6 endurance with upside, or a 2/3 flyer with endurance that comes with a 4/4 owl with flying. Long story short, it's not actually free, right? It's still costing a card, and for a card, it is woefully understated. Alright, moving on really quickly here, we got Wanted Poster. So card draw in green. Some are saying this card is good because green needs card draw, but I actually don't think it's good in any color combination that's lacking card draw. The reason being is it's basically a combo card. You want this alongside one of your removal spells, and it basically turns your removal spell into a cantrip. Basically, you can turn your Slay into 4 mana, kill a creature, draw a card, instead of 3 mana, kill something. Which is good, certainly. However, in order to make this work, you need to have, hopefully, many cards in your hand, so you can have this alongside a removal spell. However, if we enter a format where Nightfall, which I'll get into later here, is a prevalent mechanic, where players are drawing tons of cards, where you may have more card draw and can reliably see this alongside removal spells, this could be a very good card to constructed. And it's just good to see more card draw. Card draw has been an issue in the game so far, having choices, having cards at your disposal. And I think it's good that they're introducing more card draw, especially cheap card draw like this. Alright, moving on. Disjunction. Disjunction, I just want to mention here that I'm really happy with the commons in this set. I'm glad to see we're actually getting commons that are powerful. I think that's important, right? You don't want every format-defining card, you don't want every constructed playable card to be as complicated, over-the-top, rare, or legendary. Sometimes you want your role players to be more underspoken, more accessible. This is a great example of that. So Disjunction is maybe the solution in a lot of ways to relics in general. It's finally a card that is essentially never dead, right? So long as you're playing relics. And I think this is important because, one, it fits smoothly into one color, it's a fast spell, it's cheap. With the other relic removal, the problem with that relic removal was it was, generally speaking, just bad if your opponent didn't have relics, whereas this in the right deck has some utility otherwise, and that's really important. Long story short, you want to incentivize players to play relic removal so that relics don't become this issue where either I play relic removal, that's terrible if my opponent doesn't have relic, but I essentially need to win if they do have a specific relic, and you bring it to the point where I can play these sorts of cards, and it's a big boon if my opponent does have crucial relics, but if they don't, it's not a catastrophe, potentially, if I'm running some of my own. And this is important, these kind of modal cards, because the marquee format of Eternal is ladder. So you don't have side decking, you don't have the nuance of deck design, of deck building that comes with side decking, and so this is sort of like a side deck card, right? This is the ladder equivalent of a side deck card. It's something that gives you added utility in specific matchups, but crucially isn't dead otherwise, so you can justify main decking it when you're going into the ladder. Alright, long story short though, fantastic card, I'm very happy to see something like this. Next, Cover Darkness. So this introduces a really interesting mechanic called Nightfall, which I think is phenomenal. It introduces sort of a solution to the problem with cantrips. So the problem I've had with cantrips for the longest time is, on the one hand, they're important. You want these cards that draw you more cards just so you have more choices. Choices are what make card games interesting, it's important to have a steady flow of cards. However, the issue with a cantrip is a draw is usually worth, say, 1.5 mana, power, whatever your resource is, potentially 2 depending. It gets kind of tricky. But long story short, all the design space on a card, every single stat, every effect, every keyword, takes up cost, right? Takes up power, takes up mana when you're designing the card. And so what happens is when you tack on draw to a card, that takes up a lot of the design space. There's a lot less you can do with it. However, with Nightfall, it is a cantrip, but it's also drawing your opponent a card. As a result, you don't have to hold back on card design. In fact, you can make the card slightly more complicated, slightly more powerful than it otherwise would be for its mana cost, or in this case, its power cost, which is really cool, a really cool solution to the issue of cantrips, and a really cool solution to an issue the game has had, which is not enough card draw. This two-sided card draw is very interesting, a very daring mechanic, and a very interesting one. As for this card itself, that's another matter altogether. This is clearly the weakest of the Nightfall cards so far, clearly something that's designed for, say, draft. However, I do see a sort of scenario that's highly unlikely, where this does see play as sort of a finisher. So imagine, will you, a world where Nightfall is kind of the marquee mechanic of the format, where everyone's playing Nightfall. As a result, people are losing life every turn, people are drawing a lot of cards. It's very conceivable that players will enter board stall situations where each player is at roughly, let's say, maybe a little less than 20 health, right? Somewhere in the mid to low teens. Then this, if you drop it, can break that board stall, can win you the game out of nowhere. So I could conceive of a scenario where it's actually constructed playable. The chief issue here is that in a board stall situation, usually players are holding on to fast speed removal. Since it's not really useful in a board stall situation, they're really saving it for priority threats. And then if your opponent manages to, say, annihilate one of the cards you target with this, then you lose out in a big way. And so potentially it probably won't be good, but I could see a weird scenario where it is a good, maybe even one-of finisher in a Nightfall heavy format. Alright, moving on from Cover of Darkness, we have Jump Kick. I'm not really going to talk about this card that much. You can compare this directly with Levitate. Levitate does the same thing, but in lieu of giving your unit +1/+1, it gives it flying. And a card is worth so much more than +1/+1, which is generally inconsequential. Your unit maybe will deal 1 more damage, or will be chump blocked instead of trading. But generally speaking, is just a purely inferior version of Levitate, and you don't need that effect so desperately that you're going to be running this on top of playset of Levitate. So long story short, not a playable constructed card. Hellfire Oni. An interesting card, something of a difficult card to evaluate since we don't necessarily know which weapons we'll have. However, really quite an interesting one. I think it could potentially be good. However, the problem is I think it's way too slow. Yes, it's great if you get the double trigger on the weapon, but then it encounters the difficulty of a lot of weapon class cards, which is once your opponent then kills it, say with an Annihilate instant speed after you put the weapon on, then you lose a lot of value. Now, people point out there are some cool combos. There's Shogun Scepter. There's also, I'm actually forgetting off the top of my head, but Shogun Scepter is a good example, in that even if your opponent then annihilates it, you still get 2/1/1 or 2/1 Oni Warriors, which is great. However, it costs 4, doesn't have much of an immediate impact, and can be torched. And I know people are probably tired of hearing the argument dies to torch. However, torch isn't the only card. There's also annihilate. There's a lot of cards it dies to pretty immediately at a tempo loss. And so I think probably not a constructed playable card. A very interesting card design, but probably not that playable. Silverwing Smith. So I'm not going to discuss this too deeply. This is more a draft domain kind of card. But in constructed, right, it's just not doing much for you in the 3-drop. There are some very powerful 3-drop constructed cards. In this particular slot, a great example is Valkyrie Enforcer, which this card directly competes with, which not only has better stats with 2 more power, but also silences a unit, which in many cases is essentially removal. And so competing with Valkyrie Enforcer and several other good 3-drops throughout the game, it's unlikely, pretty much impossible, that this card is going to see any semblance of constructed play. So we'll move on here. Next is Cowardice. I think Cowardice could see constructed level play. Or at least, at first I was pretty big on the card, but that's because I play Control. And this is really good if you're up against Control with an aggro deck. It is essentially unconditional removal at 2, which is pretty great and actually something you want. However, in aggro matchups, this is only good specifically when you're racing your head on the race, right? Your opponent can't block you. There are a lot of cases in aggro matchups where you as the aggro deck are the defensive player, and then this becomes a dead card, and in that case it's just not that good. Maybe if the curse deck is really powerful, this will see play. But otherwise, what is good about this card is actually on the tournament scene, this is finally like a good side deck card for aggro. Aggro has not had a lot of good side decking technology, and this is actually great for aggro side decking. It's something you bring against control decks if you're in Shadow. It actually is a real big role player. Getting rid of, say, a Sandstorm Titan for 2, no questions asked, but at the same time getting rid of a Tavrod for 2, no questions asked. Essentially any unit for 2, no questions asked, is actually incredible in a lot of matchups, and therefore a great side decking card for aggro. Something that aggro is really needed. So I think it is a good card to have and will see some constructed play. Jotun Punter. The card is hilarious, but it is a combo card that is super similar in a lot of ways to the Mentor mechanic. However, even more niche than the Mentor mechanic. For the Mentor mechanic, you just need a Mentor and another card. Here you specifically need this guy and a Yeti, and presumably a Yeti that really cares about hitting the enemy player. As a result, I think the odds of assembling that combination are so slim, and there's no real combination that's so powerful that it's worth jamming this in. So long story short, not particularly powerful card, but I applaud the flavor. The flavor is phenomenal. It's kind of a hilarious looking card. The art is super cool and dynamic. And so a cool card. A lot of new sets when they're released, I see them sort of as galleries or art exhibits. Not all the cards are functional, but they're all cleverly designed. They're all clearly a labor of love, so it's fun to admire them, right? Even when they're not particularly powerful, even when they won't see much constructed play. All right, moving on to the rares. Let's look at Topple Tower. So Topple Tower is not a good constructed card, I'm going to say. The main reason being is, first, there's no evasion, right? No matter how powerful it is, it can be chump blocked repeatedly. It doesn't really do much in a board stall situation. It's only really good if your opponent has a clear board, where if you're kind of an aggressive fire deck, you're already set, right? And the other main issue with it is that, yes, you could get a crazy deal. You could get, say, let's go crazy, say an 8-4 for 3. The issue, though, is when you have cards that are a great deal for their stats or for their cost, they're specifically good on curve, right? An 8-4 for 3 is amazing on turn 3. But let's say you play this on turn 6 as an 8-4. Then it's not that good. Especially since turn 6 you may be running out of steam. This may be your only play turn 6. And then it's basically just a 8-4 for 6, which is not good at all. And so long story short, it's not a card that's actually that powerful on curve. And as a result, it doesn't really matter that it can be more stats than it's theoretically worth. So not a very good card. Moving on to Yeti Sage. Yeti Sage is a weird one. People discuss it in aggro. I really don't think this is an aggro player, right? They're just such powerful 2-drops for aggro that this doesn't make the cut, right? There's some synergies with double damage, but generally speaking, a 2-1 for 2 is not what aggro wants. And aggro usually has the mana to cast its spells, just especially as it runs out of gas, so you don't want this discount that it gives you through trail stories. However, I can conceive of this sort of combo deck of sorts, essentially Storm from Magic, something that uses a lot of, say, trail stories to cheat out spells and do some crazy powerful shenanigans. and maybe a deck where you actually want to have 8 trail stories in your deck, and these are just 4 more trail stories that you can jam in your deck. This could actually make a deck happen, I think. Once you have 8 of a card in a deck, you have the level of redundancy where you can start to build around it. So this could lead to some really powerful, kind of weird combo decks. We don't have the pieces yet, but look out for this down the road. Lunar Magus, another card in the Nightfall mechanic. So people were talking about the Nightfall mechanic, I think, favoring aggro. One of the big reasons for this is that there was an event to essentially showcase and test this mechanic. We didn't even know that's what it was, but turns out that's what it was. And essentially in this event, players drew 2 cards a turn. However, that was very different than what we have here. Yes, aggro was quite good in that event, but crucially, you were drawing extra cards on your first and second turns. However, now you're not. And why it was so good for aggro was because you're drawing extra cards turn 1 and turn 2. Those are crucial turns for aggro. That's when you want to see your Archimport Instigators, your Oni Ronins, all your really powerful 1 and 2 drops. However, Nightfall, it looks like, won't start to affect the game until turn 3 at the earliest. As a result, it doesn't actually help you get to that early turn gas. Also, what it does is it gives players more cards. I mean, sorry, I know that sounds kind of obvious, but I'm only saying this because that's all it does, right? It's not actually ramping players. And what that means is you're not able to present threats any faster than you used to. You're still presenting the same number of threats. However, now the control player, the slower player, is seeing more cards, is more likely to have an answer for your threats. So I actually think the fact that this mechanic deals damage to you is not meant to punctuate the fact that it's an aggro mechanic, but rather to keep it from being a complete control mechanic, right? Giving the control player some penalty. But generally speaking, I do think this is a more controlling mechanic for that reasoning. As a result, I think we'll expect to see some cards that play into that controlling style. And voila, we have Lunar Magus. And all around just an incredibly powerful card. Blocks very favorably, is costed affordably, and gains you life repeatedly. This is a really interesting card because, honestly, like a lot of the Nightfall cards, and I'm not sure if this will be a theme across the board, but basically has been so far, if you do not remove a Nightfall card, then you will fall far behind. These cards keep providing repeated value, and so what will probably happen in a lot of games is the first few times your opponent plays a Nightfall card, you'll remove it, right? You're drawing extra cards, you're removing them. However, you'll eventually run out of removal. I actually think we'll get more removal in the game, or we'll see players play more removal in the game for this reason. Because if you don't remove these cards, they can take over the game. This is a card that, if not removed, will take over a game against an aggressive deck. Is essentially a win condition. And that's scary for a 3-drop. I think this card is incredibly good. Anytime a 3-drop is, in many matchups, a card that must be removed, or their player loses the game, that is a powerful card. So expect this to see, I would say, a great deal of play. I think one of the most powerful cards revealed so far. Devastating Setback. Like I was talking about with Disjunction, it's great that we're finally seeing, or rather that we're seeing more modal cards. We had the choices in Omens of the Past. I was really hoping that would not be the end of modal cards. Evidently it was not. And this is a wonderful card to have for the game because essentially modal cards are the pseudo side deck of Ladder. When you can't side deck, you run these conditional cards that give you options. But what is the value on options? Is this card good? I really want to like the card, right? However, my issue with the card is how much of a cost it puts on its various modes. I still think you'll see play. The reason being is there are very, very few scenarios where it's bad. Against aggressive decks, it's pretty incredible, even costed at 4. And against controlling decks, being able to sabotage for 4 is actually not that bad, right? Because the game's slower, and a lot of your opponent's powerful cards are high-end. That'll still be in their hand on turn 4, or when you get the chance to cast this. However, both modes are incredibly overcosted. 4 is when the game starts to get crazy, when players start applying real pressure, when Sandstorm Titan comes down. And so it's hard to say if this will... I think this will see some play, but I don't think it's particularly powerful, just because the modes are so overcosted, I would argue. I think the first mode of getting things -2/-2, I'd cost it roughly 3, and the first abilities costed 1. And I think that's maybe how they did this, right? They took a 1 ability and took a 3 ability, they put them together, and it costs 4. But you don't get both, you only get 1. So it is hard to say, but I think because ladder is such a big format, and because we don't have side deck, modes are so crucial that this will see some play. But the choices also showed that even if an effect is modal, you still need it to be somewhat aggressively costed to see play. So I know I'm vacillating a lot. I really can't tell with this card. You can probably tell that this is a head scratcher for me. But my instinct is going to be it won't be particularly good, but we'll see some fringe niche play. Alright, moving on here, we have Mindless Azaleo. He's a fun-looking fellow with a very spiffy mustache, and I think this will not be a particularly good card. The problem with this deck, the Gunslinger deck, is it reminds me way too much of the Mentor mechanic. You're not losing tempo in the same way you were, but you do run the risk of losing serious card draw. It is a deck that asks you to equip your units with equipment in a format that I predict will be removal heavy because of the Nightfall mechanic for the reasons I explained previously. And as a result, you're just setting yourself up for a lot of 2-for-1s. And a lot of these cards are just really bad if you don't actually have, say, a weapon, or if you don't have another gunslinger. If you draw the wrong cards in the wrong sequence, then they're just inherently subpar cards. So unfortunately, I can't see this deck being particularly good. However, you never know. There could come a card that says, I don't know, 2 mana, 2 power, draw a gunslinger and a weapon from your deck. There could be some cards that make this work, but inherently I think it's sort of set up for disaster. Just because you require multiple cards in combination, which is always hard to pull off, and you're setting yourself up for 2-for-1s. However, there is this weird scenario I see where it could maybe be good. So the weird scenario I see is basically that Nightfall comes to define the format, players are drawing extra cards all the time, and you're drawing so many cards that you can consistently pull off the combos with the weapons and gunslingers, and you can consistently afford to lose value, and that maybe this deck will be good. It's almost an anti-meta sort of, let's say, anti-Nightfall deck. However, I think that's highly unlikely, and I think this is not a particularly good card. Crownwatch Quartermaster. It gives you a lot of bodies, which is good, and it's a mana sink, and not a totally irrelevant mana sink. However, I think what dooms this card is the Valkyrie tag is kind of awkward. It makes its use very narrow. It needs to be in a deck that can specifically support it. A lot of the decks it would be good in, or the decks I can theorycraft and conceive of, don't necessarily want to run Valkyries. And so it's too bad, because I think it would have been a perfectly balanced, interesting card without requiring ally Valkyrie in order to get the tokens. But as it is, it won't be able to actually see play in the decks where it would want to be, and as a result, I don't think it's a particularly good constructed card. Ask for directions. Oh man, so I am just about as aggravated as the character is depicted in this art. I don't understand this card. The flavor's fun. I like the art, but it's just a horrendous card. The number of times you would have to recur it to get good value out of it is crazy, and the only way you recur it multiple times is probably in an aggressive deck. But you don't want to lose tempo in an aggressive deck, and you are losing some serious tempo if you keep paying 2 all the time. Also, if you're able to bring this back enough times in an aggressive deck to actually have it get you decent value, you probably attacked enough times where your opponent is dead and doesn't really matter. Long story short, this is just a a horrible card. Kind of comically so, and that's fine. Every set gets a few terrible cards. But long story short, I'd say don't play this. They'll watch me be wrong, right? Watch this do some crazy things, but in a vacuum, the card is just horrendous. Alright, next we're on to Mirror's Nightshade. So, this is an interesting card. People are calling it potentially an aggressive card, and I would say so, right? This is a 4/3 for 2 if your opponent has a curse. And curses include Permafrost, right? Maybe Cowardice. I think this will be an incredibly powerful aggressive tool. It does a lot of what aggressive decks want, and also gives aggressive decks, crucially, a mana sink. Something they've been in dire need of for a while, and a really good mana sink. Dealing 2 to your opponent for 5 isn't great, but both players drawing a card is pretty good, I would say. It gives you more gas. It's an effect that can add up. Long story short, I think this is an incredibly powerful card, like most of the Nightfall cards, and is definitely a big boost to aggressive decks. This is kind of showing that Nightfall can fit into many strategies, into controlling strategies, like we have with Lunar Magus, but this is showcasing Nightfall's capacity for aggressive strategies, and I think this will be very effective as an aggressive card. Alright, so next we have Night Veil Agent, another Nightfall card. So when you start your next turn at night, your Unseen get Aegis, and it has Nightfall itself. And it's a 2/2 for 2. So at first I thought the card was crazy because it's a 2/2 for 2, or just a 2-drop that requires your opponent kills it, otherwise it could go out of control. The issue though is that it actually leaves your opponent a good window of time to kill your other Unseen before the Aegis comes up. So all this may be able to protect itself repeatedly over the course of the game. Your opponent has your turn, and then their turn to kill your Unseen before they get the Aegis. So it's hard to say, because then again, right, if you don't have removal at the right time, and when your opponent's Unseen gets an Aegis, then all of a sudden you're put in this awkward spot where to get rid of their unit, you have to use 2 removal spells in their 1 card. And that's basically a threat that will exist for most of the game, because if this does stick around, it's very hard to kill off. So I think it could be very powerful, but it's a card that's going to have to require more Unseen, having Unseen be a powerful archetype. But it could be very powerful. In the right deck, it's a 2-drop that you really need to kill. Most 2-drops outside of very aggressive decks you can ignore. This is one that provides huge value, which we haven't seen from almost any other 2-drop in the game, and as a result is one to really look out for. Alright, moving on, we have, let's see, Mysterium Orb, a really cool, flavorful card, as the Explorer cards seem to be, that works with Explorers and Sentinels. This is definitely kind of a nod towards a maybe Praxis archetype, where you play Explorers that do various things. I'm trying to think what Explorers you play. We'll probably see a few more, and the idea is you use this to ramp out something big like the Great Kiln Titan, which we'll get to later. I think this card won't see play, only because Power Stone is just a better card, I think. And that's already not seeing much play, though that may change. But with Power Stone, right, you get a power, and that power sticks around, whereas this card's power is dependent on your Explorers, so it could possibly provide you, I forget if it comes with 1 inherent power. I'm going to actually look that up really quickly. It, let's see. Nope, so it could be worth 0 power, whereas Power Stone's always worth 1 and costs 1 less. As a result, I don't think it'll see play, because it would basically be copies, I predict, 5 through 8 of Power Stone, and people don't even really run 4 copies of that yet in a lot of builds. So I don't think this will really see much play, but it is very cool, it's very flavorful, and I really quite like the art. Inquisitor's Halberd. Weapons just got a lot worse because of Nightfall dealing damage to you. We just got Disjunction, which destroys relic weapons. Relic weapons just got worse. And this is already not that good to begin with, and crucially, it's competing with Slay. A good way to understand if a card is good in a card game is think, what else can I play for the same cost in the same colors? And that's usually a way of knowing if the card's good. Even if a card is less great, it can actually see play if there's not much competition. This is kind of a random example, but I remember in Magic, there was this card called, I think, Invested Wolf that saw play in Hunter. I remember it wasn't a particularly great card. Um, it was like a 3/3 wolf for 4, and when it dies, it throws out 2 1/1s, or something to that effect. But because there wasn't much doing something similar in the same spot on the curve, it actually saw play. However, this card has the opposite thing going on. It is actually, rather than competing with a bunch of mediocre cards, it is competing with one of the best removable cards in the game at the 3 spot. And as a result, I don't think this will see much play. I also don't see how it having +2 health is all that relevant. It's only really relevant when you're killing 1/3s, 2/3s, 2/2s. But generally speaking, I think it's just not a particularly good card, though clearly quite a good draft card. Alright, moving on, Agile Deathclaw. A very weird card, right? And that's for dinosaurs, but it asks 2 things of you. It asks you to add heavily a 3rd color to your dinosaur deck, and it also asks you to integrate a whole new mechanic, Nightfall, which seems like a lot of reach for a fairly underwhelming card, right? It's a dinosaur lord, but it's pretty weak on its own, very vulnerable to being killed, and probably not that aggressively costed, I would say. However, there is something interesting here that I think we'll see on some of their cards, which is it doesn't grant Nightfall, but it has an effect at night. This may be their way of balancing the Nightfall mechanic. Basically, if your opponent is playing Nightfall, some of your cards may get better at night. In other words, if your opponent's playing Nightfall, you can punish them for it by all of a sudden getting a minor but significant bonuses on some of your cards. And so I think that's actually cool, tacking on some abilities at night, letting you maybe balance out Nightfall, which I predict will be a very powerful mechanic. But that idea is not best showcased here on a card that is just bad stats for its cost, and where the Nightfall effect is pretty inconsequential, where even if you ambush this, you don't really feel like you're getting away with anything. Alright, and without further ado, we're on to the legendaries. Stella the Shotcaller. So this card has the exact same issue as the other Gunslinger weapon cards, like, what was his name? Milo Azaleo, I believe? Milos Azaleo. So same issue to a certain extent, although somewhat mitigated by the fact that she has Aegis. So at first I thought she was good, purely because she's a 2/2 for a 3 that has Aegis, and I still have not gone over Bart. However, she doesn't have really any evasion, which is what you want in a weapon card. Because you give her a weapon, she's asked to attack, but in a lot of situations, if you attack with her, she'll just die 1 for 1, and then you have lost card advantage because she's wielding a weapon. So, is it worth it though? Is it worth just suiting her up and crashing her in? And the answer is probably not, right? Because then what happens? Well, maybe 1 or 2 turns later, you're going to draw a card with a +1/+1. Great. However, you could have gone this from Inspire, which is only costs you 1 card, which then immediately replaces itself, so essentially costs you no cards, and costs you less mana. So what if you get 2 cards? Well, then run Oni Ronin, right? Oni Ronin will get you, in a lot of cases, multiple +1s on your deck, and only costs 1, and will deal a lot of damage often if you manage to get him down early enough. So there are just a lot of cards that do what she's trying to do better and with fewer moving pieces. Though again, I want to remind you of that scenario where Nightfall is a huge mechanic and the Gunslinger deck takes all that extra card advantage it's given, manages to pull off its combos, and in Stella's case manages to see more cards and therefore see more cards that have her boost, make it a relevant bonus. So it's hard to say. To an extent, it kind of reminds me of Prince Kaliseth, I think it is, from Hearthstone. It's a card that gives all units in your deck +1/+1. Is a 2-drop, and has been pretty format defining so far. However, that card, even though it has some weird deck building stuff, is far easier in that you just play it and you get the effect. Um, I don't think this will be good because it also requires you to change your deck around in even more significant fashion, and the payoff is not particularly great, especially for a more aggressive deck. Only because it takes you time to really feel the effects of the payoff. Alright, so now we're going on to, let's see, Ashara, Ruthless Assassin. So, very flavorful, very cool card idea. Unfortunately, not particularly powerful, I think for reasons that are fairly evident. I like the idea that goes out with an ally and kills it off. The problem, though, is this can just be chump blocked, and then you're essentially trading one of your small units for one of your opponent's small units, and you've achieved nothing else, and also have kept yourself from attacking with anything else. And I think that scenario single-handedly keeps this from being a playable card. However, it is a cool card for draft, and I gotta say the art is phenomenal. Temporal Distortion. Oh man, this is a very cool looking card. Will it be powerful? I predict it could be very powerful if we see enough card draw. Only in that lets you mess with your opponent's turn. The level of interactivity it gives you can be devastating. And this looks like a card that's miserable to play under. And yet at the same time, with cards like Disjunction, it can probably be removed fairly easily. So it's hard to say. It's actually a really hard card to evaluate. There's a lot of power behind the card. I think it will be pretty good. Worst case, your opponent disjunctions it, and that could be bad, but oftentimes not completely catastrophic. Also, your opponent won't always have the relic removal for it. Then the high end is all of a sudden you have this major advantage in the game that doesn't cost you tempo and lets you essentially do all these shenanigans on your opponent's turn. I think a lot of people are not understanding how much value a card gains when you make it fast, right? This card is sort of a weird ramp in a way. Yes, because it gives you double mana, it gives you mana on your opponent's turn, but not only does it give you, more power on your opponent's turn, it also makes your cards worth more power. When you're casting a Harsh Roll on your opponent's turn, I would value that at actually 7 power. So you're essentially making your spells into... You're making your 3 cost spells 4 or 5 cost spells. You're making your 5 cost spells maybe 6 or 7 cost spells. You're essentially upgrading all your spells and giving yourself more power to play with. I think this will be powerful. I think this will be a control finisher. It may not have the pieces now, but this is a card where it's only a matter of time, just because of how powerful it is to be able to interrupt your opponent's turn. Interactivity is powerful. A lot of powerful decks in card games try to make it hard for the opponent to interact with them. But in this case, when you play this card, it's impossible for your opponent to avoid interaction. And as a result, this should, if it sticks for just a few turns, win you the game in short order. Alright, so I'm very excited about that card as a control player. Next, Nametaker. Nametaker is not going to be good. It just costs too much is the issue. It's a cool card idea. But we recently saw a card, which I think I skipped because it's not on the list here, but Hush. That does something functionally equivalent for only 3. But long story short, Nametaker is a cool idea, but it costs 8, and as a result is not going to be good. You would play, well, I guess you may not be in the colors, but you would play Hush before you play this. And this is more of a flavorful card. But I'm glad, right? You don't actually want all legendaries to be that good, because then you feel this need to buy all the legendaries, which deals some damage to your wallet. So I think it's actually great that we have some Mimi, some lower level yet interesting legendary cards. Alu, Dream, Death Dreamer. So a 2/5 flying for 6 is, I just think, too bad stat-wise, right? And also, until turns, maybe 7 or 8, where you can play a curse alongside this, it's not doing much for you immediately. As a result, it could just get annihilated. You really can't afford just be playing some 6 drops that are just immediately annihilated. I really can't see this being that good. Nightfall Trigger is relevant, but generally speaking, I don't see this as a particularly good card. However, who knows, right? If the Unseen deck is a thing, it could see play. But unfortunately, a lot of card games boil down to, does something have an immediate impact? And more crucially, what are the stats for its cost? A lot of it's just a numbers game. And this is a pretty abysmal stat line for 6. So I think just due to that fact, unfortunately, you won't see play. This is actually the kind of card I could see potentially getting a buff partway through the season, the way Direwolf Digital likes to do. They may give it a slight buff in stats. They may decrease the cost a little bit. But this seems like the kind of card that was created cautiously with the knowledge they can tweak it later if need be, since it seems to be very cautious stat-wise. Alright, next we have Vicious Highwayman. Something I thought was an aggro card the second I saw it, just due to the colors, to the fact that it's pointing a gun at me. But then I realized it's actually pretty defensive, right? It's a card that comes out and immediately gets you probably 4 health and kills an Oni Ronin, or something in that vein. It's a weird set of colors to put this in. It's good anti-aggro, but at the same time, it's a weird anti-aggro card, I would say, because part of what it does is also attack your opponent, which you really don't want to be doing. Maybe it's more of a mid-range card. Actually, I'd say that is probably exactly where you want to put this. It's a mid-range card that essentially makes it so that you win the race against aggro decks. Yeah, so I'd say it goes in something with Stone Scar mid-range deck, and in there is actually probably pretty good. But I can't see being good outside of a mid-range deck in those colors. Alright, we've gone for a little while here, so I'm going to try and wrap things up here quickly. We have 2 more cards. We have Rindra the Duskblade. So the thing with the Nightfall cards is, in order to promote the Nightfall mechanic, which I think Direwolf Digital clearly wants to do, you need the cards to be just good cards, right? Because they're essentially netting you no card advantage. You can basically, not entirely, but you can sort of evaluate them as you would a card without Nightfall. Just ask yourself, how good is this card just in a vacuum? And it's a 5/5 for 4 with Lifesteal and Overwhelm, so it's a really good card. And as a result, it's going to see play. And this is, I think, a sign, along with the other Nightfall cards, they're all pretty powerful, that they really want to push Nightfall. They want us gain those extra draws. This is sort of their mechanical solution to the issue of card draw in the game. And in order to do that, they realize this is one of those rare cases they just need to really push the card, just make them really scary and powerful. This is a really scary and powerful card. It's good for the same reason I think Elude Death Dreamer won't be, just pure stats for cost. So yeah, not much to say here, just a good card. And last but not least, Kuriox, Insatiable Seeker. So on the one hand, I love the card as a control player. I think it's cool. It's in tricolors. And it's a 7/7 for 6 with flying, which is not bad. The main issue with the card, I would say, is for all the influence requirements, for all the cost, it has no immediate impact. However, it is very hard to kill. So I think this card could be good only because it's hard to remove. There are very few things that do remove it. And so that may mean it can stick around, it can hit the enemy player. When I first saw it, I thought it would be completely unplayable. But as we've seen all this relic support, as we've seen more and more quality spells, as we've seen more card draw, letting you more easily get the power requirements for this, as we've seen the format shaping up potentially, I could actually see this being good. Especially since a lot of removal will get used up on a lot of those really powerful Nightfall cards. So your opponent may have no way to deal with it. It may be able to hit them, and if it does, you get 3 cards, which is a pretty powerful effect. And just because we get more card draw doesn't insubstantiate card draw. In a way, it just makes it a battle of card attrition, right? Who can get access to more cards, the most cards of value. And this helps you do that in a lot of ways. So I actually see this card being good, which is a very much 180 from where I stood originally. Though don't don't be mistaken, right? It could be bad, certainly. But it has, I think, what it needs, which is a huge payoff, good stats for its cost. Um, the roughest part of it is the influence requirement. You do not build your deck around it. You play it if you happen to be those colors. But if you are in those colors happily, and you can meet the requirements for the card, it's well worth playing if you're essentially in the neighborhood. Alright, so this went on for a while, but that basically wraps things up. Here are my thoughts on the cards, on their constructive viability. I may do a series of smaller videos on the cards more individually as the week goes on. But anyways, that's essentially in a nutshell. Hope you enjoyed my thoughts and opinions, and yeah, that's about a wrap.